I'm Dave Hurvitz. I am the founding partner at Theory Research. Our organization specializes in understanding the networks of thoughts, feelings, and memories that shape how people think about different topics, whether it's categories, whether it's brands, and so on. Why we think this is important is that it allows us to really understand how brands and categories live in the consumer's minds. For the past 10 years, we've been collaborating with organizations like the Hershey Company to enable a fundamental mapping of the thoughts and feelings that are shaping consumers' behavior so that we can then build brand strategies that are fundamentally synchronized with those thought patterns. Today, what I want to do is build upon Andy's introduction, and also a key theme we hear across the past couple of days, which is how important the subconscious is in terms of shaping consumers' behaviors, attitudes, when it comes to our brands. And it leads to a really important question that I think we all need to consider, is that we know this is true, we know the subconscious is important, but what we don't often know is, do you really understand what are the subconscious beliefs and emotions that are driving your consumer's behavior? Answering this question allows us, if we didn't know, it allows us to fundamentally change the way that we engage with consumers and shape our strategy. So today what I'm going to do is two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to just talk to you a little bit about what we know in terms of belief systems and how they operate subconsciously. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a case where we've applied this to the Hershey brand to show you how we're enabling synchronization between the consumer subconscious and their brand strategy. So, something fascinating. It's so obvious on the one hand, but amazing feat of the mind on the other. You see this image of an apple, and instantly and effortlessly something happens in your mind. Without having to think twice, you know what it is, and then with that comes with a whole host of information. Once it's recognized, you know what it tastes like, you know what you can do with it, you know whether or not you like it. You have a whole range of personal memories associated. So this simple perception of this apple instantly brings to mind this vast range of information instantly and effortlessly. How is it that the mind does this? How is it that we go through our days and just automatically we can understand everything that's going on in our environment and make decisions that are adaptive towards that? The answer lies in what we call mental models. So a mental model is basically a system of beliefs, emotions, and memories that work together to shape your thinking about any topic out there. In fact, you probably have a mental model for just about anything you can think about. And these mental models are the fundamental basis of how we think and behave in regards to the entities and events of our world. Now, what's fascinating about our mental models is that much of the activity of our mental models actually occurs in the subconscious. We're not aware of what's actually going on in these models. But in the subconscious, they exert a very powerful effect on both how we see the world, literally how we see the world, as well in terms of how we behave in regards to our experiences. So let's take two very common examples that you all probably are familiar with, but that really powerfully show the subconscious influence of our mental models. The first one is the placebo effect. So you have two products here. You have a Tylenol, and then you have a generic. People take the Tylenol and they report that they have longer lasting effects and more powerful effects. Why is that? When the actual active ingredient in the two products is absolutely identical. In fact, not only is the ingredient identical, it's the same amount of the ingredient as well as the same format. It actually comes in a tablet that looks exactly the same. The answer lies in what we believe about Tylenol and our mental models of Tylenol and how that's different from generics. In our mental model of Tylenol, we have the belief that it's more powerful. We have the belief that it is more effective than the generic, and that then translates into how we actually experience the product. Another very timely example of the subconscious influence of our mental models is fake news. So why is it that we see this trend right now, all this reporting around people believing these stories that from an outside perspective are seemingly absurd, but people really do believe them? And the truth of why they work so powerfully lies in our mental models. When the mind takes in information that coalesces with our existing belief structures. We take in that information at a subconscious level and feel that it's true. There's a subconscious feeling that it just resonates with what we believe, so we then experience that as seeming factually correct. So both of these examples show us that at this subconscious level, information from the world and our mental models are influencing our experience of the world. So to Andy's point, another really important fact that I think this community is all beginning to galvanize around is that our brands are mental models. Our brands are essentially a network of beliefs and emotions that live in our minds that fundamentally shape the way that we think, feel, and behave in regards to our products. So our perspective on the industry is that by understanding consumers' mental models, we can begin to build brand strategies that synchronize with them and impact consumers in a much more powerful way. So how do you do that? How do you actually map a mental model? So about 20 years ago, I can't believe it's 20 years, but 20 years ago, I was working in the Harvard Department of Cognitive Psychology. And while I was there, our lab, what we were studying is how is it that people organize thinking about a topic, maybe an anxiety was a lot of our work, and then how do these thought patterns get organized, and then how can we manipulate them to sort of change the way people think about things? Our work caught the attention of some professors over at the business school who became very interested in seeing whether these techniques could be applied to these psychotherapeutic techniques could be applied to the context of business research. This started a collaboration, and one of the outputs of this collaboration is this technique that we call mind modeling. So mind modeling is essentially a research technique that just takes best of practices from cognitive therapy and psychoanalysis and applies them or retrofits them for the purpose of consumer research. Essentially, what this allows us to do is it allows us to activate a specific model, say the model of your brand and consumers' thinking, and then systematically understand each idea and association that's in that model. The result of this is essentially this fully integrated understanding of the thoughts and feelings that are shaping the way people think about a topic, such as a brand, a category, an innovation space, and so on. With this, it really allows for a new type of strategy. It allows us to start building strategies that are fundamentally grounded in the both conscious and subconscious drivers of consumers thinking about a product or brand. So with that, your strategies then resonate with consumers or are able to speak or connect into consumer subconscious in a far more powerful way than traditionally available. So for the remainder of my time, what I want to do is I want to show you this actually in practice, sort of a mini case on this in some work that we did with Andy and the Hershey company regarding their flagship brand, the Hershey bar. So it was about 7 years ago, and Hershey was experiencing some shifts in their brand performance that they were trying to understand and rectify. So the first thing they were seeing was just a slowing of growth. The other thing that they were seeing was premium brands were sort of cutting price, and consumers were trading up and starting to sort of switch their brand usage and affinities. And then the third thing that they were seeing that was part of the challenge was just in general their advertising was not resonating. So they hired us to try to understand, what is going on in consumers' mindsets, both consciously and subconsciously, and how can we then impact that in order to sort of elevate their emotional resonance with consumers. So what we did for this project is we essentially mapped two different segments mental model of the Hershey bar brand. The first segment that we mapped were our frequent users, and they would help us understand, what are those factors that are driving their brand affinity, what is going on with them that's creating an emotional relationship. And the second group of consumers we looked at were lapsed users. So these are consumers who used to be Hershey most often, but now we're switching out to other brands. And what we wanted to understand with them is what is going on in terms of their thinking about the brand that's making them switch out, and then also what shifts in psychology do we see once they've switched out? Does their brand perception change? For today, I'm really going to just focus on a few learnings on our frequent users to show you sort of what these models reveal. So What comes out of this is essentially these schematics of what the consumer's mental model looks like. These schematics, or these visualizations of the mental models, much like you see with a lot of associative networks, have different components to them. Product attributes, brand imagery attributes, experiential components, and so on. So I'm just going to give you a quick tour of some of the dimensions of the Hershey frequent user mental model. So the first thing we see here are these series of brand image attributes. So these are sort of those image equities that live in consumers' minds with the Hershey brand. Now, what's important with chocolate is that when you think about chocolate products, solid chocolate, your Dove, your Hershey, your Ghirardelli, at a product level, there's not a ton of differentiation. But what we see is that the images that live in consumers' mind play a major role at sort of amplifying the differentiation between, at a product level, similar brands. With the Hershey bar, there's a couple of things with brand image that's really fascinating. So the first thing that we see here is that the consumer's image of the brand is so tightly tethered to their history with the brand. So the fact that they've been connected to it for a long time creates this upper level of concepts, which is this notion that there's this nostalgic connection. It's this thing that's been continuously tethered to my traditions and memories across my years. So that's part of their image, is just about their personal relationship. The other interesting dimension of their imagery with the Hershey brand is sort of in this bottom cluster that centers around this notion of Hershey's as a classic and original of the category. And with that, what consumers' model shows us is that the brand kind of brings them back, or is reminiscent of a simpler time in history, or a simpler era in life. So this first portion of the model really centers on sort of what are those image equities in consumers' mind. The second component of the model are more of those sort of product attributes that create an overall differentiated brand experience. So here what we see in the model is that you have, for example, the concept of the bar format. So you have a Hershey bar that has all these multiple individual pibs. And then consumers talk about this ritualistic consumption experience of breaking one pib off at a time that prolongs their engagement in the experience. So again, each of these equities sort of shape the differentiated product experience with the brand. The third level of the model is more of like, why does this matter to consumers? What is the truths about how this connects into and is relevant in their life? So it's that brand relationship or need state model. And the last portion of the model is really around that emotional equity. What is the emotional connection as a result of this differentiated set of ideas in consumers' mind? So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to really just talk a little bit about this emotion. But the first thing I want to tell you about is how these models can be understood at a higher level of resolution. So one thing about mental models is you can look at them at the micro level, all of the individual concepts and associations that are involved in consumers' thinking. But then what they do is they ladder up to sort of these fundamentals about the brand, some fundamental truths. So we have the fundamental product truth, the fundamental brand truth, and the synchronicity between that and the fundamental consumer truth. And out of this, you get sort of this emotional essence of the brand. So just in sake of time, focusing on the emotional essence of Hershey, what did we see here? So when we look at consumers' mental model of Hershey, this notion of authentic happiness comes up again and again. Now, the idea of happiness is a massive idea, and we know there are many, many brands sort of positioned within this space. But when we talk to consumers, what they tell us is that there's something truly unique and different about the happiness that they associate with Hershey. In order to understand that happiness, what we have to do is we have to actually look at the set of connections that are defining it within consumers' mindset. So when we look back at their model, what we see is that authentic happiness, or the happiness of Hershey, is about this sense of familiarity. It's something I've known and grown up with. It's something that's been an experience that's been part of me for an extended period of time. It's about this sense of being enveloped in warm, comforting sensations. So this happiness comes with the melt of that chocolate and that familiar taste enveloping the mouth and creating this very unique sensory experience. The authentic happiness of Hershey's is also about this notion of a moment of mindfulness, stepping away from the chaos of the day and feeling connected back to the things in life that really matter. So what we see in these models is that you can start with some concepts that are very big and macro, but as a result of the model, get a very brand-specific understanding of the exact meaning of that concept for your brand. For example, the authentic happiness of Hershey. The other thing that's interesting with the models is that they begin to give us a lot of clues on how we can actually activate the ideas within the models, right? So as you go through and you understand what's underneath the models, you begin to get all this language, imagery, metaphors that sort of correlate back to the different components. So when we look at the emotionality of Hershey's and we look across a very large group of consumers, what we begin to see is trends in the metaphors, trends in the visualizations, trends in the language that shape their thinking. So when consumers talk about the authentic happiness of Hershey, basically the three metaphors we consistently see is this notion, it feels like being home with family, or it feels like being nurtured by someone you love. Or the one that I always found was most interesting is that the authentic happiness of Hershey is most like stepping back into a simpler era in my own life or a simpler era in time. So with this, Hershey was able to then begin to synchronize the consumer's mental model of the Hershey brand back to their strategy. And with that, we'll see in the next set of presentations how that begins to result in communications that resonate with consumers on a deep emotional level. Thank you.
So we've done this methodology across most of our brands. In fact, Hershey, we just got through it doing it globally. So the difference in the mental model in China versus the US versus Brazil, Mexico, Canada. And the good news is there's a lot of things in the mental models that were similar that we can make great advertising about. The bad news is, as you kind of saw the diagrams, the mental models up there, they're complex. Could you imagine the fun I'd have putting that into a creative brief, going to my agency and saying, hey, could you communicate this? Probably wouldn't go anywhere. So we also just went through a very large quantitative study. And I'm not going to take you through the results, but we did it across markets, about 60 attributes. We used Sentient, phenomenal work. And what we're able to do is find out how strong those connections are actually in the brand or in the brain. So the very simplified version of how do you read this, anything above that top line is incredibly strong, instantaneous. The first line or bar you see is chocolate. If I say Hershey, you immediately think chocolate. When you get to that kind of association, it's getting to the point where I say chocolate, you think Hershey's. That is a very strong, strong brand. The two red things, think about what we were just talking about, authentic chocolate, connecting to things that are important, happiness. So all the things that came up in these qualitative models are also coming up as very strong connections in the brain. So there we have the kind of global uniform brand architecture and creative brief that we can give our agencies to develop advertising. Now the other problem I have is I'm now spending all this money and all this time to understand the emotional connection you have to my brand, yet there's very few measures out there that can get the emotional measure of my advertising. So when you start getting into this more emotional space, I can't go back and just ask you, do you remember this ad? Did it move you? Think about when you see those great ads, right? The hair on your arm stands up, you get goosebumps, you feel something. And so one of the keys was finding a way of measuring that emotion. Our next speaker, Mikhail Yatma, actually is the founder of Realize, and we've become a huge fan because a couple things I find interesting is this is the first time I've ever done ad testing where my creatives in my ad agency are going, this is great, it's making us smarter. It's no longer a report card and they're pushing back. I'm also getting real-time results, fast and affordably. And now we're finding out we can do studies that we never could dream possible before. I go from an animatic to a final ad or finished ad. I can now go test it before it goes on the air. I tweak an ad, I can now affordably test it. So it's become a great tool in our tool bag to make sure we're getting even better and better ads. So Mikkel's going to take you through kind of one of the more recent ads created through these insights and how it was tested.